Hello and welcome back. In the last video, we had a look at creating this reusable modal component. In this video, we'll have a look at creating a modal for the Add Income button. If we have a look at our final project, we can see that clicking Add Income allows the user to add an income amount and a description for the income. We can also see the income history. We will also introduce Firebase Firestore into our project. We will also set up our Firebase account. We will add a Firebase Firestore database to our project, and we'll also create our very first collection for income. We will write logic to add new documents and read documents for our app. Our first step is to create our Firebase account. You can access Firebase by going to firebase.google.com. You can create your account by going to Sign In. You then need to sign up with a valid Google account. After signing in, you will be able to access the console. We can do that by clicking on Go to Console. We will then create a new project. We'll give our project the name, something like Finance Tracker will do. You need to accept the terms and hit Continue. For this project, we won't enable Google Analytics. Let's create the project. This step can take a few seconds to complete. Our project is now ready. Let's click on Continue. I'm just going to zoom in a little so it's a bit more visible to you. The first thing we need to do is create a new app. We'll do that by clicking on this web app over here. We need to give our app a name. I'll just call it Web App. We won't set up Firebase hosting. Let's click on Register App. Firebase will now give us instructions on how to set up Firebase in our project. The first step is to npm install Firebase. Let's actually do that. I'll copy this command. We'll now install the Firebase package by running npm install Firebase. This will take a few seconds to install. Let's go back to the Firebase page. It's also giving us some code to instantiate our Firebase project. So I'll just copy all of this code. I'll switch back to our editor. And we now need to add this code somewhere in the project. For this, I'm actually going to create a new file for the config. I'll create that file in the lib directory. In lib, I'll create a new folder called Firebase. And within Firebase, I'll create a new file called index.js. And I'll paste all of that code in here. We now have the Firebase configuration available for our project. Keep in mind that if you prefer, you could move these values into environment variables. But for Firebase projects, this really isn't important. We will have a look at Firebase security rules later on in this project, which will secure access to our data in the backend. Let's go back to Firebase. Now that we've installed Firebase and we've added the configuration to our project, we can now click on Continue to Console. Under Build, go to Firestore Database and click on Create Database. We will be using security rules later on in the project to secure the data, but for now, let's select Start in Test Mode and click Next. You can now select your Firestore location and enable. After creating the Firestore database, you'll be presented with this dashboard. From here, we will be able to see all the collections in our database, as long as any documents belonging to those collections. If you're coming from a relational database background, you might not be familiar with document-based databases or NoSQL databases. There are quite a few differences, but in a nutshell, you can see a collection as being a database table, and the documents within the collection represent table entries. In this video, we will work on the logic to create an income document in the income collection when we click on the Add Entry button. Therefore, back in Firestore, we need to add a new collection, and we'll call this collection Income. After adding the income collection, Firestore will ask us to create our very first table entry or document. Documents have unique identifiers. We can just tell it to automatically create an ID for us by clicking on Auto ID. Alternatively, you can enter anything that you want. We can then create the fields on this entry. For income entries, we will have an amount. Firebase offers quite a few types to select from. We've got strings, numbers, booleans like true or false. Maps look like JavaScript objects. We have arrays that look exactly like JavaScript arrays. Null values, timestamps, geopoints are perfect for storing data like latitude and longitude, and references to other documents. For our amount, we'll just select the number type. Let's enter any value here, and let's add another field. For income entries, we also want to store the description. This will be a string type, and the value could be something like salary. And let's save this. We can now see the structure of our Firestore database. We have a collection called income. We have a document with a unique ID, as well as the fields that we've specified. If we wanted to add additional fields, we can simply click on add field. And I actually do want to add another field to this for a timestamp. This way we can show the date and the time that this entry was created. I will change the type to timestamp, and I'll just select a date and time. And I'll click on add. We now have our first set of data to work from. So next we'll go back to our project and we'll start implementing the logic for this income modal. Instead of using dummy data, we'll now write data to our Firestore database, and we'll read data and display it in the history. Okay, let's create our add income modal. And let's go back to our page file. In the last video, we added this modal component. And at the moment, it's just writing out hello world. Also, it's attached to the add expenses button. What we'll do instead is we'll attach it to the add income button, and we'll give it content relevant to the add income functionality. Also, just calling this modal is open and set modal is open is just too generic. If we have more than one modal, we want to specify exactly which modal is open and which modal we want to set. For instance, the expense modal, income modal, and view expenses modal. Let's therefore rename this state. I will call it show add income modal, and we'll rename the function to set show add income modal. Initially the state will be false. I will then replace this as well as this function. We also need to make changes to our add expense button. For now, I'll just remove the call to this function. I get an error. That's because I'm not running the dev server. Let's just run the dev server, npm run dev. And now we're back up and running again. When I click add expenses, nothing happens. So let's go back to add income. I'll add an on-click event listener. And when we click add income, we want set show add income modal to be set as true. Let's test that out. When I click on add income, the modal opens. Now we can change the content of this modal. Also, I'll just change the comment here to say add income modal. Let's have a look at what the final version of this modal will look like. Back on the final project, when I click on add income, we basically have two sections. We've got a form for the income amount and description. We have a label and an input element for the amount, as well as a description and input element for the description. And we have a button to submit the form. The second part of this modal will be the list of salary items. Let's work on the form first. So back in our code, we'll replace this header with a form. We'll also create a label called income amount. We will add an HTML4 for the amount input field. Just below the label, we'll create a new input element, which can be self-closing. This input element requires a few fields. Firstly, we'll make it a type of number. We'll set the minimum amount of 0.1, so that's 1 cent. The values can be stepped in 1 cent intervals. We can add some placeholder text as well, called enter income amount, and I'll set the field to required. I do want to wrap the label and input field in another div just for alignment's sake. So I'll just create another div. and I'll move these two fields up, because at the moment you can see that the label and the field are actually next to each other. I do want this outer div to align these items vertically. So I'll add some classes to this div. I'll use flex. I'll align it flex column so it's vertical. And I'll add some spacing between these two fields. I'll also add some styling to the input field. We'll add some padding left and right of 4, padding on the vertical of 2. We'll give it a background color of slate 600, and we'll round the edges a bit. When we save that, that looks great. For the description field, I'll actually just copy this div and duplicate it. I'll change income amount to description. I'll add amount to description, which reminds me we also need to add a name attribute of amount, and we'll add a name attribute here for description. In this case, the type will be text. We do not have a minimum or step attribute, and we'll change the placeholder to enter income description. This field is also required. And lastly, we'll also add a button of type submit. And we'll add some styling to this button. We'll make it a BTN and BTM primary. Now that we've got all of our elements, we can see that with the amount field, we are able to increment these values. We aren't able to enter any non-numeric characters, and I'm able to enter a numeric value, and we can enter a description. If I leave any of these fields blank and click add entry, I'll get a validation error. We do have some styling issues here. I'm just going to add some padding to give some space between these elements. We can do that by adding styles to the form tag. We'll add a flex column for vertical alignment, and a gap of 4 should do. Much better. However, we can see that this button is now spanning the entire width of this element. You may or may not like this. Personally, I only want this button to take up as much space as it needs. We can fix this by going to globals and then adding the following style to the button element. Self start. This will now tell the button element, especially when it falls within a flex container, to only take up as much width as it needs and not span the entire width of the container. If we have a look at our form, we can see that we are repeating a few styles here. For the div that contains the label and the input, we've got these styles, flex, flexcol, and gap. I'd like to create a reusable CSS class that we can use for these input groupings. I will therefore cut these styles from here. Let's go back to globals, and under the utilities layer, I'll add a new class. I will call this input group. The name is not important. You can name it whatever you'd like, and I will paste those styles in here. Then I will go back to our page file and use input group as our class. I will also use it here in the description. For our input elements, we are also repeating classes. I would like all of the inputs on our application to have this styling applied. I will therefore cut this styling and go back to our globals file. Within the base layer, I will add the element input, and I will type in apply and paste those styles. In our page file, I can actually remove the class name completely, and I can remove it from here. The last part of this modal is the section for the income history, but we'll build this section once we have some data to work with. Now let's move on to integrating Firestore in our project. Actually, I noticed after closing this modal that our list of expenses are now broken. When we render out these expense items, we wrap these elements with this button element. Therefore, the self-start is now also affecting these items. So instead of adding self-start to the general button element, I'm going to cut it and I'll add it to our BTN class instead. After saving that, these expense items are working again, and the button on our modal seems correct. In order to add Firestore to our project, we'll go to the Firebase config file and we'll make a few changes here. The code that we got from Firebase simply creates an instance of Firebase. We now also want an instance of Cloud Firestore. This will act like a connection to the database itself. In the code that Firebase provided, there's this link to their documentation. From here, you can see how to integrate your app with all sorts of Firebase functions, like analytics, authentication, Firestore, cloud functions, etc. For now, we're interested in Cloud Firestore. On this page, when we scroll down, we can see exactly how to import Firestore in our project. They also provide sample code for other languages as well, like Python, Java, etc. What we need to do is import get Firestore from Firebase/Firestore. I will just copy this line and paste it here. We then need to create an instance of get Firestore using this line here. We also need to export these objects for use in our project. So I will export app and DB. We now have everything we need to start interacting with Firebase. In the next video, we'll look at how we can add and remove documents from the Firestore table in our application. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like this type of content, please consider subscribing. I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.